She was born into wealth and walked straight into hell. In 1974, an English heiress named Rose Dugdale turned her back on privilege and led one of the most shocking art heists in Irish history. The plan was perfect, the cause righteous. But what began as rebellion soon twisted into something else: obsession, betrayal, and blood money. When the alarms screamed that night, it wasn't just a mansion under siege, it was her soul. This is the story of a woman who tried to steal justice and lost herself instead. Part 1. The Origin of Evil. Rain whispered against the tall windows of an English estate, the kind of house where silence had weight and every footstep sounded like an intrusion. Inside, a young girl sat at a grand piano, her hands resting on ivory keys that had lost their warmth. Her name was Rose Dugdale. Behind her, the walls were lined with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to judge her every breath. Her father's voice echoed through the corridor, calm and cold, reminding her once again that discipline was the only proof of love. She was 16 and already learning that obedience could suffocate. When the protests against the war broke out in London, Rose left home under a gray sky. She returned hours later, her coat torn, her face glowing with something her father couldn't recognize. That night he locked her in her room. From the other side of the door came his steady, patient tone. Emotion, he said, was a disease of the weak. Someday she would be cured of it. Through the keyhole she watched his shadow fade. She never forgot that outline, the silhouette of authority, precise and heartless. It became the shape of everything she would later rebel against. Years passed. Oxford accepted her, and for a while she believed that intelligence could set her free. She studied mathematics, philosophy, art history. She joined debates, wrote essays about justice, and learned how to dismantle an argument without ever raising her voice. Yet something inside her remained untamed, something that refused to be reasoned away. In the evenings, she wandered alone through the rain-soaked streets, watching beggars huddle beneath bridges, their hunger ignored by the same society that had built her world. Each encounter left a mark, small, invisible, but permanent. Friends described her as brilliant, but distant. Professors called her gifted, but distracted. None saw the restlessness that kept her awake at night, the quiet rage against comfort itself. It was as if wealth and education were chains disguised as blessings. When she spoke of revolution, her classmates smiled politely, certain she would outgrow it. But Rose was already thinking in absolutes. To her, compromise felt like surrender. The world, she decided, would only change if someone forced it to. In the early 70s, she left England for Ireland, telling no one except a former colleague who later described her as a woman searching for a wound she could heal by opening it wider. Dublin was nothing like Oxford. The city breathed in smoke and poverty. Its walls were covered in graffiti that looked less like protest and more like prophecy. For the first time, she felt close to the people her family had taught her to pity. And for the first time, she felt useful. She joined political meetings in back rooms above pubs, her accent awkward among the locals, her ideas burning brighter than her understanding of the place itself. She wanted to fight injustice, but didn't yet know what justice demanded in return. Then one night she met a man who changed everything. His name was Martin Cahill. He wasn't a politician or a thinker or even particularly kind. He was a thief with eyes that never stayed still. She saw him across a crowded bar, laughing at something cruel, his voice carrying over the noise like broken glass. He had no education, no ideology, only confidence. He stole cars, jewelry, whatever could be sold by morning. When their eyes met, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or defiance. Two souls raised in opposite worlds, but driven by the same hunger to escape them. They met again the next day, by chance or design. Martin teased her about her accent, called her Oxford, and asked what a lady like her was doing in a city like this. She answered simply that she was tired of watching the powerful win. He laughed and said, "Then stop watching." That line stayed with her. Within weeks, she was spending her nights in his flat, surrounded by stolen watches and cigarette smoke. The walls smelled of oil and damp plaster, yet she felt more alive there than she ever had in her father's mansion. Martin spoke of survival, not revolution. To him, crime was a language, a way of talking back to a world that never listened. Rose began to understand its grammar. She learned how to pick locks, how to read floor plans, how to disappear in seconds. What started as fascination became ritual. She told herself it was for a cause, for the people, for the poor, for the silence she had carried since childhood. But beneath those justifications was something darker, a need to feel untouchable, to look her father's world in the eye and say no. Their partnership grew. He planned the robberies, she perfected them. She was precise, methodical, almost surgical. He was impulsive, reckless, but charismatically so. Together they became a kind of legend whispered in Dublin's alleys, a woman with a posh accent and a man with a gun, stealing not for greed but for some strange morality of their own. Every success made them bolder, and every escape tightened the knot between them. He admired her intelligence. She mistook his admiration for love, but beneath that bond something dangerous began to form, a fracture between purpose and pleasure. Martin enjoyed the chaos, the chase, the power of fear. Rose, though she tried to deny it, started to enjoy it too. The adrenaline felt like confession. For a few fleeting seconds after each heist, she felt cleansed, almost holy. Then guilt would return, heavier than before. She prayed without believing, whispered apologies to no one. The line between punishment and salvation blurred until they were the same thing. One winter night, after another successful job, they drove north along the coast. The city lights faded behind them, the ocean stretched out like an unfinished thought. Martin leaned back, cigarette glowing in the dark, and said the world owed them everything it refused to give. Rose didn't answer. Her reflection in the windshield looked older, harder. The rain on the glass distorted her face until she could barely recognize it. Somewhere, deep inside, a voice whispered that this road would not end well. But she pressed the accelerator anyway, chasing the sound of the storm. And somewhere in the distance, sirens began to echo through the night. Part 2. The First Crime. The night they chose for the first job was colder than the rest. Dublin's air smelled of iron and petrol, the kind that clings to skin long after the rain stops. The streets were empty, except for the hum of a single car moving without headlights. Inside sat two figures, Martin Cahill at the wheel, eyes fixed forward, and Rose Dugdale beside him, silent, her fingers tracing the outline of a folded map. The plan had been rehearsed for weeks, but now, in the stillness before action, it felt fragile. Every sound outside seemed amplified. The ticking of the dashboard clock, the soft crackle of the radio that wasn't on. Martin broke the silence first. He said it was just another house, another rich man's toy collection waiting to be liberated. Rose didn't respond. Her breath fogged the glass, blurring the reflection of her own face. Somewhere deep down, she knew this night would define her, not because of what they would take, but because of what she would lose. The house they were about to enter wasn't just guarded by locks and alarms. It was protected by the boundaries she once believed were unbreakable. They parked behind the trees, the kind that stood like witnesses no one listens to. The mansion loomed beyond the gate, its windows glowing faintly in the dark. Martin moved first, slipping through the shadows with practiced ease. Rose followed, carrying a flashlight and the weight of her own heartbeat. The wind moved through the hedges like whispered warning, but neither of them stopped. Inside, the air was dry and perfumed with old money. Portraits stared down from the walls, faces of men who had inherited power instead of earning it. Rose felt their eyes on her as she crossed the marble floor. Her shoes left faint prints on the polished surface. In the study, the safe waited behind a painting, exactly as she had predicted. Martin smiled, that dangerous kind of grin that didn't reach his eyes. She knelt beside the safe and started working on the lock. Numbers clicked under her fingers, rhythm precise, almost musical. She could feel Martin's impatience behind her, his shadow shifting as he watched the door. When the final click came, it was so soft it could have been mistaken for a sigh. Inside lay stacks of cash, documents, and a small box lined with velvet. Martin grabbed the money, but Rose's attention fixed on the box. Inside it were 3 miniature paintings, oil on wood, the colors faint yet alive. She recognized the brushwork, early Irish expressionists, each piece worth more than a lifetime salary. She stared at them, transfixed, as if she had found a forgotten prayer. Martin snapped the box shut and threw it into the bag. He whispered that they had to move. but Rose lingered. She wasn't thinking of profit. She was thinking of her father's voice, telling her that beauty belonged only to those who could afford it. The thought made her chest tighten. For a brief moment, she imagined setting fire to the room, watching the walls burn until nothing of that privilege remained. Martin pulled her toward the door, breaking the spell. The alarm tripped. The sound was deafening, a scream of metal and electricity. They ran, through hallways, over fences, into the cold breath of the night. Their feet splashed through puddles, the city waking up around them. In the distance, sirens began to wail. They didn't look back. When they finally reached the car, Rose's hands were trembling so violently she couldn't hold the key. Martin laughed as he started the engine, shouting something about victory. But she couldn't hear him over the pounding in her ears. By dawn, the city was alive with rumors. Newspapers called it a masterpiece of precision. No fingerprints, no witnesses. The stolen paintings became legend overnight. To the police, it was the work of professionals. To Rose, it was something closer to confession. She sat in a dim apartment, staring at the box now hidden under the floorboards. The air smelled of damp wood and cigarette smoke. Martin paced behind her, counting cash, already planning the next move. She listened to the rhythm of his steps, the tempo of a man who didn't believe in consequences. He asked her why she'd gone quiet. She said she was thinking. He laughed and told her not to start thinking. Not now, not when they were untouchable. But she couldn't stop. Every detail of that night replayed in her mind. The cold marble, the echo of the alarm, the sudden thrill that felt like freedom but tasted like fear. She wondered when exactly she had crossed the line. Maybe it wasn't that night at all. Maybe it had started years ago, in that locked room with her father's voice seeping under the door. Over the next weeks, the tension between them thickened. Martin thrived on danger. Rose lived with its residue. He celebrated each headline, each whispered rumor that painted him as a modern Robin Hood. She clipped those same articles and folded them into her journal like evidence of something gone wrong. Sometimes, she would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced the alarm was still ringing somewhere in the distance. The sound had etched itself into her nerves, a constant reminder that once a line is crossed, there is no way back. One evening, she found Martin in the kitchen, cleaning his gun while the radio played softly. The announcer spoke about the theft, calling it an act of defiance against corruption. Martin grinned, saying they had become symbols. Rose stared at him and saw something terrifying in his calm, an absence of guilt so complete it felt like faith. She realized then that their revolution had already rotted. The cause that once justified everything now served only as a disguise. She poured herself a drink, her hands steady for the first time in weeks. The decision forming in her mind wasn't rebellion anymore. It was survival. Outside, rain began to fall again, tracing thin lines down the glass. Somewhere beyond the city, the missing paintings changed hands. The money moved. The headlines faded. But inside that small apartment, the silence between Rose and Martin grew sharp enough to cut. The air was heavy with things unsaid, betrayal waiting for a moment to breathe. As midnight struck, the light flickered once, then died. In the dark, Rose could hear Martin's voice, low and certain, saying that power wasn't taken, it was kept. She didn't answer. The sound of his words sank into her like a warning, or perhaps a prophecy. And from that moment on, the thrill of the crime began to taste like poison. Part 3. The Collapse. The last night began with rain, the kind that blurred the city into a moving watercolor of light and shadow. Dublin seemed to hold its breath. In a narrow alley behind an abandoned warehouse, Rose Dugdale stood beside Martin Cahill, the man she once believed could turn rebellion into purpose. The plan was simple: one final heist, one last act to reclaim what they told themselves the powerful had stolen. Yet beneath the calm surface, something restless stirred. She could feel it in his silence, in the way his hands moved too quickly, his eyes avoiding hers. Every gesture told her that this wasn't a plan they would walk away from. Inside the van, the air was thick with oil and cigarette smoke. The tools were laid out like surgical instruments, each one glinting under the dim dashboard light. Martin leaned back in his seat, watching the rain trace patterns across the windshield. He said they were close to freedom. Rose didn't answer. Her thoughts drifted back to the girl at the piano, the house filled with silence. Her father's voice, what happened next, unfolded in seconds. Floodlights burst through the windows, the night erupting into chaos. Shouts outside, boots on gravel, the sharp echo of a megaphone. Martin's head turned toward her, a flash of something unreadable in his eyes, recognition or betrayal. He said her name once, softly, then ran. For an instant, she thought he would come back, that this was another game, another narrow escape. But the door stayed open, and he was gone. The police moved fast. She dropped the bag, raised her hands, the sound of rain swallowing her breath. In that moment, she felt neither fear nor anger, only an overwhelming stillness, as if everything that had ever been restless inside her had finally gone quiet. They cuffed her without struggle. Through the flashing blue and red, she saw her reflection in the police van's window, a ghost framed in neon, the revolution's last survivor. In prison, time lost its edges, days folded into one another, marked only by the sound of doors locking and unlocking. Rose rarely spoke. She taught a few inmates how to read, spent hours staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the paint. Reporters called her the lady thief, the radical gone wrong. None of them saw the woman who sat awake at night, tracing invisible piano keys across her knees, hearing in her head the music she never finished. News of Martin's death came months later, a police ambush outside the city. The words reached her like an echo from another life. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She simply turned to the window, where rain pressed against the glass, and whispered something only she could hear. Maybe it was his name. Maybe it was the sound of forgiveness. The guards said she stood there for hours, unmoving, like someone waiting for the past to dissolve. Years passed. When she was finally released, the world had forgotten her. She moved to a quiet coastal town, living alone with a dog and the sea. Neighbors said she rarely smiled. The gunshot wasn't loud. It was the silence after that tore through Dublin. An heiress turned rebel, Rose Dugdale, once promised to steal only from the corrupt. But that night, in a mansion lit by moonlight and betrayal, she crossed a line that would stain history. Beside her stood Martin Cahill, a career thief who called himself a revolutionary. Together, they broke into one of Ireland's most secure estates, claiming it was for justice. Inside the safe lay millions in art, works that could buy governments or topple them. But something felt wrong. The alarm tripped too soon. The red light blinked before her hand touched the frame. Then she saw it. Martin's reflection, half smile, half shadow. He had known. Outside, sirens closed in. She froze, her breath shallow, the weight of a lifetime pressing down. Rebellion, love, guilt, all collapsing into one final moment. Was this revolution or revenge disguised as love? Want to know how it ends? Watch the full video in the description. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime exposés.